Welcome to the pilot episode of Go With The Workflow, where we interview world-class leaders in legal and experts in workflow automation to learn from their hard-earned experiences designing and implementing process automation to make work more efficient and more meaningful. I'm your host, Evan Wong, and my day job is being the co-founder and CEO of Checkbox. And in my role, I have the privilege of meeting some seriously impressive people who have both the strategic mind and the ability to drive change and execute on workflow automation programs. And what I realized is that there is such a wealth of knowledge in the industry that currently doesn't have a dedicated platform. So our goal with this show is to bring those people who have been there, done that, and go deep on their stories, have them share their wisdom on real practical perspectives and tactics, and help you with your own journey with workflow automation. I'm incredibly excited at the lineup of guests we've prepared for you. Over the coming episodes, you'll hear from industry titans who have implemented workflow at companies like Netflix, Meta, and Yahoo. But as this is the first episode, we wanted to cover some basics. And to help me with that, my guest today is Dave Moore. Dave has spent the last 6 years deep on a variety of legal technologies, including e-billing and matter management, contract lifecycle management, and of course, workflow automation. He has seen many teams in his career go through their transformation journey with workflow, and when combined with his thoughtful and analytical mind, Dave holds an impressive wealth of knowledge that I'm grateful to be able to share with you today. On this episode, you'll hear our take on what exactly is workflow automation, what's really legal about it when we talk about it in the industry compared to enterprise workflow, where workflow automation fits within the broader legal tech stack, and how workflow automation as a product is different from workflow automation as a feature in other products such as CLM and matter management. We address misconceptions, use cases, and some of the outcomes of implementing workflow automation, and lay the foundational knowledge for the rest of the show. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this episode. So I've got Dave Moore. Dave Moore reigns from our team here at Checkbox. He's our director of sales in North America. But as you get to know him, you'll realize that he doesn't come across as a sales guy at all. But you'll see that come through, I'm sure, in this session today. But maybe, Dave, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your background? How did you end up in workflow? And I know you've spent quite a number of years working in spaces, outside of workflow, in the legal space as well. So yeah, tell us about a bit about your story.
Yeah, and nice to be described not as a sales guy, I guess. I've been in sales since I was 17 years old, so going on maybe 23 years now. I think somewhere along the way, I was introduced to cloud-based technology, and I just sort of fell in love with it. And I think maybe most relevant, like I spent the last 6 years specifically in legal tech, and I worked with clients all the way from maybe sort of medium-sized business, maybe 100 million in revenue, something like that, all the way up to, some of your global 100 companies, some of the largest, most sophisticated organizations out there. And I learned a ton working with those folks on projects that involve technologies such as matter and spend management, contract lifecycle management, legal hold, and of course, like the thing that we're here today, and really the reason why I'm at Checkbox today, which is workflow automation, and really just fell in love with the idea, and really had the most fun and the most interesting work that I've done, I think, in my career so far has been around workflow automation. So really happy to be talking with you today.
Right. And look, throughout the sort of web series that we'll be doing, we'll be covering topics from how to build the business case for workflow, deep dives into specific use cases and getting really deep across the life cycle from ideation through to change management out the other end and monitoring. We're going to be geeking out on the details of implementation and change management, and maybe even getting the perspective from CLOs and GCs around workflow automation. So really, we want to create the hub and the knowledge base and the expert sort of community around workflow for the legal industry. But today, this session is going to be a bit 101. It's sort of like a lead-in introduction to workflow, answering some of the most basic sort of questions that are still, I think, largely unanswered for many people in the industry. And so that's kind of the conversation that I'll have with Dave today. Now, Dave, maybe just to start off, given that you have spent, as you say, more than 6 years in the space, um, how do you define workflow automation? I think the phrase gets thrown around quite a bit in the industry. People hear workflow a lot, but when you ask them point blank, what is it exactly? I think people will struggle to define it. So, how do you define workflow automation?
Yeah, like surprisingly tough question to answer. I would say, so if I had a one line definition of it, it would be, the use of technology to streamline and optimize business process. But I think even as I'm saying that, I'm going to myself, like, what a bunch of nonsense that sounds like to anybody listening, right? Like, I don't even know what that means. And I think early in my career too, as I was, at least with workflow, as I was explaining it to clients, I would use cases, and I would say, okay, so here's an example of a use case. And still people would walk away going, oh, okay, so it's a tool to provide self-service for NDAs. I got it. Or it's a way to submit conflict of interest, or it's a way to onboard a new vendor. And I'm going, yes, absolutely. It's those things, but it's also a whole bunch of other things depending on your internal business process and sort of what you want to use the technology to help to automate. And so I think maybe to answer the question, I will use an example, talk about sort of some of the characteristics of business process, and then help you to understand, like, that example, how it's commonly done and how workflow automation can sort of fit into that. So I've got a friend named Julia in marketing for an insurance company, and insurance, of course, as we all know, like, highly regulated. Everything marketing wise has to go through legal. And so if Julie has an upcoming campaign, maybe there's an event that Julie needs to get some creative out into the marketplace to ramp up press for the event, or there's some product launch or whatever the case may be. Julie knows she has to pass that process, that creative, through to legal to get approval. And of course, Julie's excited about this because she knows that this is probably not the top of legal's priority list. So, typically, how is this, done? Julie has to, put together the materials for her campaign. She has to pass that through to legal somehow. Typically, what we see in the past is that, way back, if you think about it, I'm told actually that there was paper forms. You would have a file clerk maybe passing things around from desk to desk to get the proper authority and signatures. We've obviously progressed from there, and now you have things like email and Slack and still phone calls that you can use to facilitate some of that stuff. And so, Julie will put that together. She'll pass it through email to maybe the right person, or maybe a shared email inbox. And there's some drawbacks to that. Obviously, it's a bit of a manual effort to type out the email. Is she putting all of the right things into the email that legal needs to approve it? Is she attaching the right documentation? All of this is sort of an unstructured way of doing it. And so the drawback there is that all that data can't really be leveraged in sort of aggregate, so that people can see what's going on. There's a requirement, or sort of like I guess a requirement on Julie to make sure that all the information that's going into that submission to legal is the exact same information that's in the source system for her marketing campaign. So she's not mistyping things. And it can be really inefficient. So maybe legal gets that and they say, hey, we need some more information from you because we didn't get it all the first time. The other piece of it is that there's oftentimes poor resourcing. So, who's working on this from the legal side? Is that the right person to be working on it, to get into the hands of that person very quickly? And so there can be some resourcing decisions that aren't made very well in that situation as well. And all around, I think everybody's sort of concerned when you have all this email back and forth. Where's the visibility? If I'm a person that's involved, or some other stakeholder that's sort of maybe indirectly involved to the process, how do I know where we're at, and are we going to meet our deadline? And so I think oftentimes businesses will create business process around these things, which have certain characteristics. We have business process, right? So that you can have a predictable result and that you have high performance out of the process. And so for that reason, technology becomes a really, really good fit because processes have a sequential number of steps. There's typically a timeline associated with a business process. where there's an expectation, there's an understanding of what resources that may be involved or required for that process. And so, again, sort of adding a workflow automation tool lends itself really well because the characteristics of workflow automation map really well to that, based on logic and those types of things. So if we go back to the example, right, Julie's got her content and her creative that needs to go to legal. Maybe the process looks a little bit different adding workflow automation, because you can design that process and all the steps and logic into a system and sort of offload the responsibility of Julie to know exactly what that process is onto the system. You can design a form for Julie to fill out where she knows, like, these are the required things that I need to put in the first time. And then it sort of eliminates that back and forth. And when you've got structure, different from email or Slack or Teams, some of these more sort of unstructured open text type of forums, then that data can then be reportable. You can leverage those attributes. So if there's, let's take an example, maybe it's the size of the campaign, maybe it's the region of the world where that campaign is being distributed. So those attributes can be used for routing purposes. They can be used as part of an approval matrix to make sure that you get the right approvals signed off. And of course, like, there may be, not in this example necessarily, but there may be additional documentation that needs to be produced. So there's a template, and some of those attributes, right, go from the fields into the template automatically. You can produce documentation with the help of a system, as opposed to relying on somebody to go out and search for the right template. And so that situation now looks like, hey, I fill out a form, or through integration, the information goes into the form automatically. That gets sent to a person automatically, the right person. Documentation can be produced. Even things like if there's some processing of the data to produce some sort of scoring system or some insight that will help somebody make an approval. And sort of the outcome of all of that is that you get a business process now that's fast. It's totally auditable. You get all of the right information. You get visibility that you can provide to the stakeholders and anybody that might need to know what's the status of this and how are we doing with it. And then you can take all that data and sort of bubble it up and use that information to really look at your processes and make improvements and really get a lot better at process overall. So I don't know if I did a wonderful job at explaining that, but sort of workflow automation in a nutshell.
Yeah, what's really interesting about your answer, though, is that you leaned into an example that for many legal sort of departments looking at workflow, they tend to gravitate towards contracting workflows, which makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of the low-hanging fruit, the sort of most obvious use cases sit in self-help contracting. I think you used the NDA as an example, but with your example of Julie just then, the example that she was going through, it was a lot more sort of business process, wasn't it? And sort of you realize that workflow as a concept, or workflow automation as a tool, is kind of like the plumbing or the Swiss Army knife of legal ops, where you can really use it as a way to patch up a lot of the manual processes and actually it's the connectedness between legal and outside counsel, other parts of business, each other, the business clients, etc. It's very much the interaction layer almost, whether it's approvals or documents or advice or getting information, that I took away from your kind of description there.
Yeah, like, as far as analogies go, right? A perfect way to describe it. I like to think of it oftentimes as almost like a vehicle or a transit system. Whereas before, somebody's just sort of relying on their knowledge of, and oftentimes companies will put a standard operating procedure somewhere on a shared site. No one's going to that shared site. Like, we like to think that we have control over these things. Like, we rely on memory a lot. We rely on people just manually doing things. And so when you can put this thing that can operate outside of that, somebody says, click a button and pass this information over here. And by the way, while you're doing it, do these other two processes that have to take place that maybe aren't even in my department, right? That just provide visibility, or kick off these other things that need to happen, and do it in an automatic way where you don't have a human being having to to focus on that. It's just a wonderful thing to be able to provide that sort of speed and efficiency and really help to take, I think, especially for the folks in legal, that process that I was talking about with Julie and probably a whole host of other processes that are coming to your minds as you're listening from the audience perspective right now. You have things that are really high value, like high strategic value for the organization, high risk that are priorities for you. And then you have all these other things. And I've heard it like, when I get this type of work, it goes to the bottom of my pile. Probably the right thing to do, right? As your responsibility to the business. But to the person that's requesting it, that's really important for them to get done. And so it does have to be done. And here's a way that you can leverage a piece of technology that helps everybody to get them what they need faster and to remain a really great partner to the business in that way, but also focus on the things that, like, you went to school, for probably a fairly expensive education. You've got a really high skill set, allow you to work at sort of the top of your skill set and licensure and really focus on the things that matter for the business strategically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And we talk about workflow a lot, and workflow being, sometimes when legal teams look at workflow, they get really excited about it. And eventually it hits this point where they're speaking with IT, of course, because IT is really important stakeholder for us to get on board when we look at vendors. And then IT says, well, workflow automation, that shouldn't be a legal thing. That's an enterprise consideration. Have you kind of come across that before in your time sort of working with workflow over the last sort of 6 years or so, Dave, particularly in the legal context where legal is championing workflow and how IT kind of intersects with that? What's been your experience?
Yeah, I think certainly you've got all over the business. There are technologies, and you've got some overlap with, some things that this department wants to do and something that legal wants to do. I think that with workflow automation, and it did find a home. I remember hearing this early on when I first heard about it. It was like it wasn't designed specifically for legal. It found a home in legal because it was such a natural fit. I think based on the characteristics of the type of work that legal does, right? It's risk. It's very logic based. Oftentimes, there's a need for auditability and these types of things, and there's document creation oftentimes involved. And so, I think it finds a natural fit. I mean, I don't know. What are your thoughts on why it's more of a legal than an enterprise IT thing?
I think about this quite a lot, and I've really drilled it down to, I would say, three. Well, first of all, I think I should acknowledge, I think workflow automation is in fact an enterprise concept. The reason why legal workflow automation or particular tools like Checkbox are specifically designed for legal, it really comes down to three things, right? Like the first thing I think you mentioned, it's around legal processes tend to be a lot more logic based. And I say that because when you compare that with other types of workflow automation tools, as an example, like Zapier or Workado, these tools are very much system orchestration, right? They're still workflow automation, but they're automating the workflow between systems as opposed to between people that are typically doing some sort of intake, some sort of approval. And so it's the type of workflow automation, I would say. It's like an umbrella term. Legal workflow automation kind of fits as a subcategory to meet the use cases and the processes of legal. I think there's certain metrics like cycle times that's very important to legal, right? Often we get thrown under the bus around turnaround times. We might work on it for 1 hour, send it over to the counterparty, and they take 2 weeks, and to the sales rep, we took 2 weeks in legal, right? Of course we didn't, but there's no visibility in metrics, and particularly the cycle time, not just from start to end, but sort of segmented by the different parties that play a role in the overall sort of end to end. And so I think there's a lot of metrics. There's types of processes that really lean into legal as a department that is actually quite unique from our friends over in, say, HR or IT, who traditionally work with systems and not necessarily the interaction of people across the organization. But the second big thing is, I think, the focus on contracting. Because again, if you look at a lot of these enterprise workflow automation tools that are a bit more logic-based, they still typically don't have the contracting component because they tend to serve other departments that are outside of legal. The unfortunate truth is legal often gets underserved, right? And so I think legal workflow automation specifically has a focus on, document review, document generation. It's native to these systems as opposed to having to try and cobble something together and integrate it, right? So it's that kind of focus on self-serve contracting, that centricity around contracts. And then I would say the third and last thing is more of a point around time to value, which is your legal focused workflow automation tools tend to have your integrations with the rest of the tech stack, your legal tech stack, right? So things like your e-billing, your CLM, your matter management, etc. Those typically come already as part of the library, which means that you don't have to spin out separate IT integration projects. Related to that is the idea of templates. So again, these workflow automation tools will come with templates, so you don't have to start from scratch. You already have that base NDA template or the base conflict of interest or the gift register. And so what that allows you to do is not just take an IT system, which typically feels very IT, and then have to get IT people to then code and customize before you get to your sort of launchable product. It's much shorter and much easier, and typically is no code, so the legal department can also sort of maintain and configure themselves. So, it's an interesting point, because I think like workflow automation, IT, legal, they tend to kind of sometimes clash worlds. But when you look under the hood, there's a lot of specificity that comes with a tool that's built for the industry.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think I might be changing a little bit. I think IT is starting to show a little bit more love to legal, as legal is starting, especially with tools like this, right? They're starting to demonstrate that it's not that historical reputation. I think that a lot of that I've just heard over my career is that people want to get away from. It's like a cost center or a bottleneck or what have you. I hear all the time legal is finding ways to demonstrate how they're impacting revenue, how they're enabling the business, and this is one of the ways that they can do that.
Absolutely. And I see that as well as a big part into the data piece. I mean, we talked a lot already about the sort of the efficiencies and sort of going from manual to automated, but there's a whole entire data layer that kind of wraps around once you start to bring things from, the more manual methods. And I'm not talking about necessarily paper-based. I'm talking about things that might, to your point, just be email, Slack, and Teams, where that, communication and that data isn't captured in any way. There's no business insights that come out of it. But when you start to shift these processes into more structured formats, then you start to also get the dashboard and the analytics and the reporting around, how often are we getting certain types of work? What are the types of work? Which departments are coming to us more frequently? And are there any bottlenecks actually in the processes that have been designed that actually allow us to free up that efficiency in the business, but also, again, be able to demonstrate that value, to your point, that legal has in the organization? So I think, that's a really interesting point you made.
Yeah, the analytics piece is probably the most interesting to me because it's so strategic. But I think that there's a few different things that I look at. Like, one is sort of that tactical piece, which is what's coming in and what's the volume of how much is coming in and how are we allocating it and how quick are we getting it done. I think that there's sort of a reputational piece to it as well. So when you were talking about, hey, it came into us and we sent it back and it sat with the counterparty for 2 weeks, and I've heard stories where you get a deal that goes south, right? Who everybody wants to point the finger at legal. Look at this. And so, but hey, we have the data now. No. To your point, it sat with the counterparty for 2 months at a time, and the whole thing lasted, a year long, and that's how it got lost. It wasn't us. We were turning around an average of 2 days or something like that. So there's that risk to sort of the reputation management piece of it. And then that third piece I think is really interesting too, which is not just like how quickly can we turn around work, but the ability to go in and look at process and say, hey, we can see the milestones between when things are happening. Like, where are we getting stuck? And do we need to go and deliver some training to the business? Or do we need to optimize like the product? Do we need to go in using this low code tool as a business user and say, hey, if we just eliminate this step, or if we added this field, we get this piece of information earlier, and we can actually improve this process and then go back and demonstrate to the business, hey, look how much time we just saved. Or look how much money we just saved. through efficiency and gains. Really powerful stuff. So
Absolutely. And you've spent, obviously a lot of time in other systems as well. Sort of what do you see? And I have my thoughts too, but I'd love to hear yours first. Like, where do you typically see workflow automation as a technology fit within the broader legal tech stack? I think, today, a lot of people, when they think about legal technology, and sort of the first place they go is either, sort of e-billing, where they're trying to get some efficiencies on outside counsel spend, or they might look at CLM, which seems to dominate a lot of the conversations at conferences and things like that. But workflow automation, you'll hear here and there. You'll hear it on panels. You'll hear certain people on their journey get a lot out of that. But where does it exactly fit? If we were trying to create a mental model for workflow, so that people, when they're sort of designing that tech stack, where do you see it kind of fit into that tech strategy?
In between and everywhere, I think that I wouldn't pretend to tell a business which is the most appropriate for them to do first. I think so. If you take a look at your overall spend, and it's pretty darn low, and you're using a small group of vendors, right? Is e-billing going to give you like the biggest gain compared to maybe you've got lots of process and a high volume of requests? Is that going to be better than workflow? I don't know. Oftentimes, what I've seen is that e-billing can have a huge return on investment, right? So there's big time savings to have there, and it's an awesome technology. But workflow can be an amazing companion to that. So as you think about how you're interacting with your vendors, maybe there's certain information that you want to capture with them. Maybe there's a certain way that you need to engage with those vendors, and you can leverage a workflow tool in combination with your e-billing to get further value out of it. And I think maybe that's the point that's really not misunderstood, but like maybe not emphasized enough in our discussions, Evan, is like this tool not only is going to give like the workflow automation tool is not just going to give you your efficiency gains from the processes that you automate, but it's also going to enhance the value of your other tools. So I don't ever think of it as should I get e-billing, or should I get matter management, or should I get CLM versus workflow? I see it as get workflow and get those other things too. And whatever step that you need to take in terms of a technology selection first, do it with workflow, because you can get a lot of information. I've worked with companies where they said, here's the honest truth, we don't know what everybody's doing. Okay. And it's a scary thought, but until we figure that out, we don't know where we want to invest in technology next or in people next, right? So we need to figure this initial piece out, provide some sort of intake and understanding of what's the volume and what's the type of work and how are we spending our time before we go out and invest further in technology. So it's a long-winded answer, but I think like in between and everywhere is where I see it fitting.
Yeah, I like that answer, because it shows that you're sort of focusing on business value and what is the problem to be solved here, right? Because there is no one answer for all departments. It really depends on, taking a diagnostic approach and seeing what sort of works for you. But I think, like, to your point, like workflow being the plumbing aspect, I agree with, by the way. I think it's like a very useful tool that's sort of agnostic in a way to any particular, like, that's interesting about workflow. It's agnostic to any particular use case, which is why it's so flexible to really connect all of the different parts of your tech stack and the enterprise tech stack and the sort of people that wrap around the systems as well. I tend to see it as having two other roles, by the way. So sort of there's the plumbing aspect that you kind of alluded to, but also one that's really emerging over the last few months that I've seen in just almost every conversation I've had is the front door. And I think you mentioned intake a little bit there, but it's really the concept of the front door, and it's the experience of how does the business interact and sort of request help from legal. And workflow has really emerged as the kind of technology to address that particular that area, because of how flexible it can be in designing those experiences. And so that's what I've seen. Another key role of workflow, it's like, how do you design that top layer interaction between legal and the business? Then you have sort of the plumbing that you talked about, But then the third role that I've always known workflow for actually initially is really around the self-help tools that sit at the back of the plumbing. So it's almost like your catch-all for the rest of the use cases that don't actually fit well in any of the existing systems, right? So if you've ever come across like a process that you want to really improve, but you're like, it doesn't really get solved by CLM because it's not really contracting, or maybe the maybe like the design is not flexible enough, or maybe it's doesn't fit with your, say, e-billing system or ELM, etc. Often what happens in those cases is workflow is a good solution to those sort of, you know,
That's right.
tidbit use cases all over the place that don't fit into your kind of existing tech stack. And so, you know, it is your self-help, maybe NDA for the more straightforward sort of contracting use cases, but it could also be like your, like, where would you fit a conflict of interest use case? Like, it doesn't really fit in any of those traditional pieces of the tech stack. So workflow automation is sort of that catch-all. So I would say it's like the front door feeds into the plumbing. The plumbing then has either on the endpoints, you know, your e-billing, your CLM, your actual lawyers who may need to work on the strategic work, but also you might have a suite of self-help tools or approval processes that's actually powered by the workflow automation platform itself.
Yeah, it's funny too because what I've seen companies do with this, those processes that you're talking about, they're everywhere,
Mm.
and you see it happen with companies, and like sort of the light bulb goes off, and they'll say, "Well, we initially brought this in because we had these five right initial processes. We thought these are like things we need to solve for right now." Okay. But then, they start to get and they go, oh, wait, this could be good for that. And then somebody else that interacts with that process goes, hey, what are you guys doing with what is that thing? We need that. And then it just sort of, I've seen it go viral where now you've got processes that are being handled by workflow automation that are even going beyond legal, and they're going into HR, and they're going into some of these other departments where they can be really of value. Maybe it's still touching legal, to some degree, but maybe they're not even the process owner anymore, and it's just sort of spread because it is that thing that can fit in between, where it's like, maybe there's a system out there that handles that one thing, but I don't want to buy a system that I have to go in and I got to go through all my approvals. I got to get budget. I have to have IT build it out and go through this big configuration implementation process. I have this thing over here that fills that gap so nicely, and I can build it myself. Oh, like that's where we start getting excited and seeing companies really excel and get like maximize their value out of a tool like this.
Yeah. I've seen organizations, I mean, I've seen legal departments specifically become the champions of almost transformation through workflow because of that, the visibility. Like it just has so much visibility to the rest of the organization because of how outward facing it is. So that totally resonates. I've got one last big question for you. This is a challenge. This might be a challenging one, Dave, but I'll throw it at you anyway. Workflow automation. We talked about the phrase being used a lot in the industry, and we hear a lot here and there. And maybe part of the confusion is because workflow automation is a category in of itself as a technology category, but it's also sometimes a feature of some other categories. Like you might hear CLM talking about having workflow automation, or matter management having workflow automation. And I think that kind of creates a little bit of confusion there. I'm not saying that they don't, they do, but I would love for you to clarify, like, how do you see the difference between like a workflow automation platform versus like workflow automation as a feature in some of these other tools?
Yeah, so I think you are right. A lot of tools have workflow included in them, even in the ones that we've been talking about, CLM, matter and spend management. Some of those tools have an element of even low code workflow automation built like within them, right? I think that the key difference is that, and maybe there's two. One is I think licensing, so like the commercial structure of how workflow is commonly sold. And I think the second one, which is probably the more important one, which is user experience. So the licensing one I think is easier to sort of cover. With no code workflow automation, it's not a per seat license, right? So whereas with matter management, e-billing, with CLM systems, right, you have a per seat license. That means that if you have a workflow that needs to go out for approval to your finance team before that contract can get out the door, or whatever the case may be, they need a license too. And you may be able to make use of some sort of limited privilege at a lower cost, but even then, you're still managing a license for a user, and they're getting them on board in their profile and so on. And so there's a licensing piece, and then I think the other piece, which again is I think more important, the user experience piece, which is um, with those systems workflow. Let's imagine that I'm a person that's part of a process, right? I'm not in I'm not on the legal team, and so if I'm, let's say it's matter management related, so there's some legal dispute, or there's a matter that I need to weigh in on, or provide approval, or provide input, or whatever the case may be. If I want to use the workflow in that system, I'm now looking at going into that system specifically in order to provide my input or intake some information that allows me to make an approval or a decision or what have you. And there may be multiple of those. So I may be participating in a matter management system, but also a CLM, and also an e-discovery, and so on. And so now those are three different systems that I have to learn. And at least from what I've seen, most of the time that means that I'm looking at a screen that wasn't designed for me, both in terms of how it's laid out, but also the language that's being used. I'm not a legal person, so if I'm looking at I'm trying to think of like a really good example, but let's say I'm looking at a contract and someone's asking me, do we need a warranty clause? It's like, well, I don't know what a warranty clause is, but you could ask that question differently. Like, do we need to know that the person that's discussing information with us has the right to discuss that information because we're going to be using it in some other way? It's like, that's more of a business way to ask the question, do we need a warranty clause? You can create an experience with workflow that really meets a user in sort of layman's terms, the simplest possible communication style. You can create an experience where they get an email for their part of the workflow that has a link in it, and you click on that link and it opens up to a page that's got just the information that you need to do your part. Not like every screen that's available within a record, within a matter management, but just the part you need. And that allows you to have an experience as a user that requires absolutely no training. It's the same as any website that you've ever been to in your life. There's an instruction: click this box or answer this question, or here's where you input this information, and you hit submit, and it goes on to whatever the next sort of experience is. And so I think sort of like the non-training part, the being able to see things in your language that are catered, like the experience catered to you, and then not having to like find your own way to log on to something. If you have a matter management system and you're working with your outside counsel, you either provide them a login, or you have a tool that's capable of going beyond the bounds of your system to even external parties, the parties external to your company, for them to be able to participate in this. And a workflow tool can do that in a way that that doesn't require them to create an account and again sort of train on the product. So I think it really comes down to user experience.
Yeah. I was told by someone a few weeks back, it's very similar to some of the insurance website products you go on and you're trying to figure out what insurance product's right for you. The user experiences in those tools are so limited to exactly sort of the question that you need to be asking yourself at that point in time with the information that you need. And there's really nowhere you can go wrong with kind of just clicking through, answering questions, and you kind of let the system that's hidden behind like guide you to the correct point. And I think that's kind of the point you're making around the user experience, which is you really can't go wrong with it. Like it's almost like it's a tool that doesn't even need training for the end user because it's so restrictive in exactly getting them to do what they need and what you want them to do. Being able to launch out of different sort of entry points as well, I think is a very interesting point. Like again, going back to the point of interfacing with the business, being able to embed within your existing CLM, right? Like you don't have to launch necessarily out of workflow tool. You can embed workflow throughout all the systems that you have and meet the users where they are. I think is another key part of differentiation.
Really huge, that it's so easy to integrate with other things, because ideally you wouldn't see a form at all, right? If I have all my information in Salesforce.com, why not just have the ability to say, package this stuff up and send it into that form behind the scenes? Like the form is easy, right? It makes it easy for somebody without the training. But if you've already got data in another system, right? Take the data risk out of play altogether and integrate it where possible. But I totally agree with your point. Like, it's the lack of training. It's the idea that somebody can get in and use it day one and know exactly what to do because it's in line with other experiences that they've already had. It's the user expectation with other software that they already know how to use is built right into it. So yeah, 100% agree.
Amazing. Fantastic. Well, that's a really good start, I think, to the series. I think we've covered some fantastic points and some foundations, and probably cleared up a lot of maybe misunderstanding or perhaps open questions around workflow before we dive into all the guests that we'll bring on board. And on that note, Dave, I'm really excited for the upcoming sessions. We're going to have directors of legal ops from companies like Netflix and Spotify and Meta and NetApps. And people who have really been there and done that with workflow. So I'm really excited for the upcoming sessions. Like I said, we'll be covering topics from not only how to build the business case, but right through to implementation and down to specific use cases and going really, really deep. So I think this has been a great sort of overview, sort of pilot episode, but we'll be definitely getting much more deeper, much more tactical and action orientated with the coming sessions with all of our friends in the workflow automation space. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Go with the Workflow. If you found it valuable, you can subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app like Spotify or Apple Podcast. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leave a review, as that really helps other listeners find the podcast too. That's all for now, so we'll see you at the next episode.